Ciao YouTube. What if I told you that Donk's grip, the very best CS2 player in the world, is objectively better, but not for the reasons that everyone else is telling you? Hi, my name is Bardos, I'm a former Valorant and CSGO pro player, and I used to hold world records in both Kovacs and Aimlabs. I'm also in the process of unwashing myself, grinding games again, so that I can prove that aim training does indeed help, even when you're 30 years old like me. The videos on this channel are all focused on improvement, self-improvement, and being the best version of yourself. So welcome if you've never been here before, and let me explain to you why Donk's grip is actually better, but not for the reasons you think. Now, if you're here and you don't know who Donk is, you're probably not a CS2 player, but let me just tell you, this kid, because he's still very young, just basically appeared onto the scene from an academy team, Spirit Academy, and just basically showed everyone that with raw mechanical skill, being super confident, micro movement, and just impeccable entry fragging, he can dominate the tier 1 scene, which is what he's been doing. But he has a very peculiar mouse grip. Now, his grip isn't unique to him. We've seen other pro players in CS have a very similar grip, and I think they don't know why, but they're all doing it for the same reason. Obviously, I'm not the very first person that tried to analyze it, but I've watched all of the other videos, and it really seems like everyone is focusing on the biomechanics of it all, but they're all missing a key technical component that has to do with sensitivity and mouse sensors that to me is extremely important, and I've kind of been thinking about for many years. You see, in 2020 and 2021, I was the undisputed #1 aimer when it came to static clicking, which is a type of aiming where the dots don't move on the wall and you flick to them and you have to be very precise and very accurate. Now, most of my world records were with the G Pro X Superlight, the mouse that everyone knows, everyone kind of loves and hates. But then the actual final number that I got, which was way higher than the competition, I actually got with the version of this mouse that is wired, the Outset AX. Back then, I couldn't really put in words why I preferred this mouse, but then I realized it's for the same exact reason that these pros are using this grip. Let me explain. To understand the point, you kind of have to understand that when you're aiming with your mouse, your aim is mostly divided in two movements. Really three, but let's focus on two. Arm, wrist, and then yes, there's a little bit of finger adjustment, but the most important two when you're talking about the big swing, the big flick, and the micro correction, which is the tiny movement that comes after to make sure that you're on target, is arm, that just swipes across the mousepad, and then wrist for these tiny movements. Now, your wrist is kind of stuck. It can't go any further than a given amount of angle in a direction, and it can't do it in the other direction either. So you're kind of stuck. If you're at a given point and you're trying to micro correct or flick with your wrist, you can't go any further than this. So it's a given angle that's stuck and it's just biomechanically decided for you. Why am I saying all of this? Well, because I want to introduce a new concept. I don't really know what to call it, and it's not really that new, but I think people aren't connecting the dots here, that I want to call wrist sensitivity. You might be familiar with a way to measure sensitivity that's called centimeters by 360. And that's a way to measure your sensitivity in a way that lets you know how many centimeters of movement onto your mousepad map to a 360-degree rotation in the 3D world. Now, that makes perfect sense when you're talking about your mouse just translating on the pad. But I think what's happening here is a case of a different sensitivity. I think it's still correct calling it a sensitivity, even though you're not changing any of the numbers in the game or your DPI, but you're changing the relative sensor position to your pivot or rotation in your wrist. So basically, when you just translate your mouse with your arm, centimeters to 60 will be true and accurate across all grips, all mice. That's your sensitivity. You move your arm by 10 centimeters, you just translate the sensor by 10 centimeters, and they will map to a given rotation in-game that depends by your DPI and in-game sensitivity. But The second part of the motion, where your arm isn't moving and you're just moving your wrist, depends on one more factor. Even at a fixed DPI and sensitivity, the relative position of the sensor versus your wrist will determine what I'm calling wrist sensitivity. Now, think with me. Imagine that your sensor of your mouse, the part that actually translates, was exactly at the same level as your pivot, as your wrist. If you were to do this, since the sensor would only be rotating around itself and not actually translating, you wouldn't see any movement on the screen in perfect conditions, because these sensors don't report rotation. They only report two numbers to your computer, dx and dy. They're differentials. They're basically letting you know, compared to the last reading, how much the sensor thinks it moved on the x and y axis. That's what people call dots, or really counts is what engineers call them. So your mouse only knows translation. So if you have your mouse exactly on your wrist and you rotate, as you can see, the sensor is only rotating, it's not translating, and therefore it won't report any movement. This means that if you had a mouse where the sensor was perfectly at the level of your pivot of rotation, you would have functionally zero wrist sensitivity. That means that even if you were to flick with your wrist, nothing would happen on screen. So this is the extreme, right? So this is pretty obvious. It's something that people talk about when they talk about fingertip, for example. It's clear, and some mice manufacturers already talked about this, that the further away your sensor is from your wrist, the more your fingers and your wrist will have amplified sensitivity. Now, when I say sensitivity, I mean that equal amounts of movement will result in larger amounts of movements, therefore higher sensitivity in game. And this isn't like abusing the term, because that's exactly what happens. The exact same wrist movement will end up causing a larger rotation of your camera inside the game. So let me give you a tangible example of why this matters. I told you before that I had world records, and that my most famous world record was in one Wallace's Sargas Mall in Kovacs. Now, I want to show you something exactly about the mice that I talked about before. This is the aforementioned GPX2. This is how I grip the GPX2. Now, I went ahead and I measured the distance with this mouse between the sensor and my pivot. Then I did the same with the way I grip the outside AX. There's a 20% difference, as in, the way the outside AX is shaped, I end up with a 20% closer grip to my wrist than with the GPX. This means that even though I use the same sensitivity for the world records, the one with the GPX was 61.2 centimeters, the one with the outside AX was also 61.2 centimeters. What happened is that functionally, my real sensitivity with the outside AX, when it came to the micro corrections part, was closer to having something like 75 centimeters. It meant that the same wrist movement that I would have made with the GPX at 75 centimeters caused the same displacement as the one I made with the outside AX at 61.2. And this is a big, big deal. Let's get back to Donk for a second. Donk's grip looks something like this. Basically, and the historical reasons for why these people grip it like this, if I had to guess, is probably just that they were children when they started playing, and these mice were too big for them to actually reach the buttons and the scroll wheel, so they had to naturally grip them further up the mouse so that they could reach. And then that's where they learned, and that's where they stayed. But the effect is that functionally, their wrist is much, much closer to the sensor than if they were gripping it normally. This could be something even up to like 30% closer. Now, why am I using percentages? Let me show you. Okay, so look at this, because it's important that we quantify if this thing even matters or not, okay? So say that this is your wrist. So this is the pivot, okay? Call it W. And of course on this side there's the arm, but we can ignore it for now because we're saying that it won't move. And this is the maximum that you can move your wrist. So the maximum flick that I talked about earlier. Call this angle alpha. And say you have two possible sensor positions. This one, which we're gonna call A, which for me might be, for example, the outside AX. and this one might be B. Now, I don't want to just waste your time or get you bored, but ultimately you can think of these, since this angle of maximum rotation is fixed, you can see that W, and call this, you know, MF for maximum flick and MF1, because these are half of your maximum flick, right? This is really what matters. Like visually, you can see that if my sensor is at B and I move my wrist by alpha, it will move by MF2, the segment that goes from here to here. And if my sensor is if my sensor is at B, if my sensor is at A and I move by alpha, then it will move by the shorter maximum flick that goes from here to here. So even visually, you can see that there's going to be a difference. Your maximum flick is going to be shorter. Therefore, at the same sensitivity, you will have a lower sensitivity in game. But it's important to quantify how much is this. Now, it's very simple because this is about similar triangles. You can see that WAMF and WBMF1 are similar triangles. They have the same angles. One of them is 90 degrees. One of them is half of alpha, assuming that you're perfectly symmetrical in your flick. And the other one will be 180 minus those two. Now, when two triangles are similar, it means that their sides are proportional, which means that if I double the length of A, which means I put the sensor twice as far, the other side of the triangle, MF, will be double in length. This is huge because it means they're directly proportional, which means that if Donk's grip, say, let's imagine, okay, Donk plays at 800 dpi, 1.25, okay? And let's say that his grip has his sensor positioned at length, let's say 10 centimeters. And let's take another player with the same mouse, same settings, 1.25, but their sensor is at 15 centimeter distance, okay? That's 50% further away. This means that when they're moving their mouse with the wrist, this player B will functionally have 50% higher sensitivity when trying to microcorrect, which is equal to trying to do 1.25 times 1.5. 1.25 times 1.5 is equal to 1.875. So what I'm saying is that even though they have the same mouse, same DPI, same sense, but such vastly different grips, because maybe this is Donk grip and this is a fingertip grip, which is adding a lot more distance from the sensor, when making the same wrist movement, it will be as if the second person is playing with 800 dpi 1.875, which is a much, much higher sensitivity. The opposite is also true. Given the same 125, if you have someone that will be playing at a closer sensor position to the wrist, they will have the benefits of the higher sensitivity, and that's what I think Donk and Zaiwu and these other players that use this grip are doing. You will end up having the benefits of a higher sensitivity when it comes to arm. So for example, since Donk is an entry fragger, he can rotate better, he can clear angles, but when it comes to actually being precise, he will have the same sensitivity as someone that has a lower sensitivity but a normal grip. So I think what Donk is doing, and Zaiwu and Monesi and anyone else that's picking up their mouse higher, is functionally keeping the benefits of the higher sense, but also having the feeling and actual, it's not just feeling, it's actually the sensitivity with the wrist of a lower sense. So they end up being able not to give up the benefits of the rotation that a high sense gives you, so they can still entry frag, rotate around fast, but they don't lose the control like they would if they were playing with a higher sense. So this is huge. And as you can see, it's really quick to have an actual tangible difference. Because to give you the final example, in my case, with the GPX, remember, I was 61.2 centimeters. And then with the AX, I was also 61.2 centimeters. But since I told you that the ratio was 20% smaller, so you can say that basically the AX was 0.8 times the GPX. You do the math, it ends up basically being exactly that when I was flicking between longer targets, I had the same sensitivity as 61.2. on the GPX, but when I was doing the micro corrections with my wrist, it was the same as using the GPX with about like 75 centimeters, which is a noticeably slower sensitivity. So this is really big, and I think more people need to talk about this. And it makes sense that this type of grip would be used in a tactical shooter, where you want really the lowest sensitivity at which you can still comfortably turn around really quickly. Now, before we draw our conclusions, I also want to give you a practical example of what I'm talking about. I will now show you how by changing my grip, I will functionally change my wrist sensitivity. It should be pretty obvious from everything else you've seen, but I just want to show you how easily that happens. So I'm going to grip this outside AX normally. So let's call it normal grip. I set this at 400 dpi so that I could fit in the screen. And let's start from here. Maximum left rotation. So you can see this as far as my wrist goes on the left, and this as far as it goes on the right. So let me do maximum left. And I will go to the maximum right that I possibly can. And this is as far as I can get, so right at the edge of the screen. Now, I'm gonna grip this like Donk. So let's call this Donk grip. And I'm gonna do the same. So maximum left, all the way to the right. Maximum right I can possibly go. So you can see I can't really physically move my wrist anymore to the right than this, and I was struggling. And you can see the difference is pretty noticeable. So this translates in game. It's a big deal. So all of that to say that if you want to experiment, these grips are not just about the pressure, the finger position, how they feel. They have an actual tangible difference because they will make it so that you can use a higher sense with the same level of control as a lower sense. It's not just about feeling. This is a measurable, real difference. It's not just about comfort or anything like that. So I would say if you're willing to try it out. See if you can learn to use this different grip, because in tactical shooters, it might have a tangible benefit. And in general, I would say from now on, when you try different mice, also see how the shape of the mouse positions the sensor relative to your wrist, because that will also change your wrist sensitivity, and it's an impactful difference, so much so that it had an impact on my scores back then, and I didn't even realize that. So I hope you will experiment, because that's always fun. I don't recommend anyone switch to this grip immediately, because I think that for some people it might just be impossible to learn a grip like this. Me personally, I'm not switching, but I definitely will consider using more mice where the sensor ends up being closer to my wrist when I'm playing tactical shooters, because I do think that the benefit of the higher sense and turning around, but the control of the lower sense is indeed a big deal. So that said, I hope you guys liked the video, and I hope I will see you soon.